So if you're watching, welcome to the Southern Christian Coalition Weekly Lectionary Show. This is a new program that will be discussing kind of the news of the day and also the Revised Common Lectionary text for the upcoming Sunday. Today on the show, we have really a fantastic power panel to start us off. We've got the Reverend Dr. Teresa Smallwood from Vanderbilt Divinity School. We've got Reverend Kristi from Glencliff Presbyterian Church. Mm-hmm. And we've got the Reverend Dr. Earle Fisher of Abyssinian Missionary Baptist and just about every higher education institution in Memphis from the TV. And we've got at least one furry friend on the line as well.
Yeah, he's very excited about the panel.
Right. So it is the 29th of April. That is day 47 of coronavirus here in Tennessee. On Monday, restaurants across the state were allowed to open up for dine-in business thanks to Governor Bill Lee. Today, we're going to start seeing retail businesses open up. And on Friday, on the 1st, we're going to have gyms. You're going to be able to go work out in public. And the Lee administration says, you know, we just saw a 1.35% increase, which is the smallest increase we've had in a very long time in new cases. But I want to be clear, that's still 134 new cases. And on Sunday, to put all this in context, on Sunday, the day before we opened up restaurants, we had 478 new cases. And if you take that whole weekend as one unit, we went from 8,726 cases on Friday to 9,667 by the end of Sunday. That's a 10.8% increase in just 2 days in the total number of coronavirus cases in Tennessee. So that's where we are. And meanwhile, we've got some, I think it's about 400,000, I don't have the number in front of me, but it's a little bit less than 400,000 new unemployment claims in Tennessee because of coronavirus. And with these folks going back to work, with these businesses opening back up, we've got this clip that I want to try to share with everybody. Let's see if I can do a screen share here. And that's, I need this to get out of my way. We've got the Lee administration saying, this is some great sound. We're gonna have to restart it. Hold on a second. I apologize, everyone. We'll get this better with practice. Mm-hmm. But this is pretty important. And it started at 50 seconds.
Being worried about contracting the illness if they go back to work, that would be a situation where they would not be eligible to continue to receive unemployment benefits. That's correct. Thank you.
So that's anybody who doesn't go back to work because they're worried about their health and their employer is open will not be eligible for unemployment benefits. Kristi, if you want to put yourself on mute for a second there. And we're going to try to turn up the volume here. So anybody who's not returning to work because of they're afraid of coronavirus, because they're afraid that they might get sick or infect their family or anybody else that they come in contact to, that person will lose their eligibility for unemployment benefits. And that was the end of the press conference. I don't know if you all heard that. It was kind of quiet. But the next thing that was said was, there will be no further questions at this time. So that's the state of Tennessee. That's where we're living right now. And with that, I want to open things up to go back to the lectionary. That's the other purpose of this show. And so today we've got Acts 2, verses 42 through 47. We've got the first 6 verses of Psalm 23. We've got 1 Peter 2, verses 19 through 25, and the gospel lesson is John 10, verses 1 through 10. And I don't know if anyone else picked up on this, but it is Sheep Week in the lectionary. Everything is very much about sheep and shepherds. Now, Dr. Fisher, Earle, I know when we talked before, you had some stuff about what was going on in Memphis that you wanted to talk about. Please tell us what's going on.
Well, let me thank you too for extending the invitation, and I am praying God's choicest blessings on this initiative and on the Southern Christian Coalition. And it's a pleasure to virtually meet Reverend Moore and Reverend Dr. Smallwood. In Memphis recently, we've seen some interesting developments as it relates to the economics of it all. And I do think, at least for me, that this is tied into some of what Jesus is addressing in John 10, and I know we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the city council appropriated about $10 million this week to go for COVID relief. That is, as I understand it at least, even beyond the $113 million that the federal government has appropriated and sent to Memphis as part of the CARES Act. So for me, I'm thinking about how we could possibly get calculations that are needed about the number of people who have been laid off, not just the number of people who have filed for unemployment, as you stated earlier, Brother Joe, but how many people were laid off per county across the state, or per zip code, especially as I think locally, how many people have filed for unemployment, what has been the average wage loss, so on and so forth. And I think that these numbers should be disaggregated by race. I was one of the people who was trying to advocate loudly and aggressively for data disaggregation along racial lines as it related to testing early on. And I'm saying that this is necessary information because it can give us a sense of the economic impact as we are suggesting that we'll be responding to it, because historically and far too often what we have seen is money come through the state or your county or the city, and it does not go to the places that it is needed the most. And so I would like to have data presented up front before we start talking about how we're going to send this money to this organization, that organization, or that institution, or even this individual, because as we saw federally with the SBA loans, you know, we don't want the local roof Chris, if you will, or the Lakers, you know, or the Grizzlies, if you will, to get, you know, an inordinate or inequitable share of the money. So, you know, those are things that I'm thinking about in terms of just the current issues, even beyond what I'm trying to reflect upon as it relates to Scripture.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that onto our context today. Does anyone want to start us off? Does anyone have a place where they're itching to go first? We've got 4 options.
I don't have a starting point with the scriptures per se, but I just want to reiterate what I believe I heard, because I so resonate with what Dr. Fisher has said. And one of the themes that really runs through all of this in my mind's eye is this idea of who is expendable. Mm-hmm. And even in a pandemic, what we have is a need for some covering, because quite frankly, the expendables are always going to be expendable. And what we know about government is that it really does not change its method. Its method stays the same no matter how much the pandemic brings people to their knees, no matter how many doctors call out or nurses call out. There is a need for somebody to envision a new way, because governmental standards and ways will kill people. They will sacrifice people. So not only do we have this thread of sheep and shepherds, but we have this thread of thieves and bandits. We have this thread of those who literally will take the decision about profit and measure it up against the hearts and minds and bodies of individuals. And so with that then comes a need for reordering of society. We're not in a place where we can just think that the government's going to do right because folks are dying. They're not. And so when we have that, you know, coming together in small groups is important, because it helps us recalibrate what our morality really is all about. The thief and the bandit will stand under trees and say, I am the chosen one. The thief and the bandit will say, listen, let's do some experiments on folk. Well, who do you think would be the people that would be experimented on? There are historical antecedents for that. And so race, yes. Ethnicity, yes. Xenophobia, yes. All of these things. And so the scriptures remind us that there needs to be some understanding of where your real comfort, where your real covering, where your real capacity to survive and strive comes from. And then it also indicates to us that we need to form some hearing aids that allow us to know whose voice to listen to and how discernment should be operating in this moment. Because if you're not able to discern whose voice it is you'll hear, you'll follow every wind of doctrine out there. And those winds of doctrine will lead you into a complete storm. And before long, you see that even your own decisions about how to follow crazy people, mad scientific folk, will lead us into places of destruction. And that's, I think, a real important aspect of what I think Dr. Fisher raised that we need to be real mindful of.
Brother Joe, if I may, at the risk of Reverend Moore highlighting another passage in the lectionary, let me build upon what Dr. Smallwood has said too, because that thieves and bandits piece has struck me. I definitely appreciate what she has described in terms of the hearing aid and the voice piece. I'm also thinking about how the passage in John 10, my students in the preaching class this week were preaching their final sermons, and some of them were preaching from this particular passage. So I've been reflecting on it for the past couple of days. And the figures of speech, Jesus using coded language, I think is important. And so it's one thing when someone who is advocating for you is helping you to understand the times by offering coded language. It's another thing when people who are organizing and implementing structures that stand against you are using coded language. And I think that's what we find too often in halls of Congress through legislation. This is why so many of the corporations can use these corporate loopholes and get access to the funds. And so I want to anchor back into the economic piece. I appreciate Dr. Smallwood's concentration on the medical impact of this, which I said for the longest here in Memphis, that I feel like the economic impact is going to be even more negatively impactful than the medical impact. Yes, I've advocated too for the covering of masks and ventilators and gowns and things of that nature. But as I think about, again, this economic piece, I'm thinking about something a sociologist named Matt Desmond asked, which is, what if poverty, going into what Dr. Smallwood talks about, the expendables, because it seems rather clear right now that we're dealing with elected officials who are more concerned with profit margins than they are people on the margins. So Matt Desmond says, what if poverty isn't an accident, it's a robbery? And one of the local journalists that I think it has her thumb on the pulse of what's happening in Memphis, Wendy C. Thomas, builds upon that inquiry and posits, if poverty is a robbery, then there are thieves. And the thieves' names can be known. So when you start talking about thieves and bandits, I think it's interesting to see who it is that is organizing and structuring the inequity, using coded language oftentimes in legislation. And I think our responsibility, to Dr. Smallwood's point, is to be that clear voice to help people decode the language.
And if I could just build on that idea of coded language. Sorry, Dr. Smallwood. I heard something really great the other day that pointed out Jesus is talking about the metaphor. He's using language referring to being a shepherd, being driving sheep through a pasture. All of his disciples, everyone who's around him, they're fishermen, right? It's a completely different trait. So he's using a completely different paradigm than what they're used to operating in. It sometimes feels like that's, ties in with what you're saying, is that if we're going to have a word for ministry, it can feel like we're speaking a completely different language about what's important than some of our leaders are. Dr. Smallwood, you were going to say something. I got in right before you there.
The only thing I was going to say was amen. Amen.
Well, some powerful takes on the gospel so far. Kristi, I'm wondering what you're thinking about with this text, if you want to share with us. We'll risk some barks here.
What has been said so far, and that was certainly my thinking too in terms of preaching it. And I should point out too that for preachers, I'm kind of extending this text. The lectionary text is John 10, 1 through 10, as you pointed out earlier, but I like to take it further to get the whole section about the shepherd and the shepherd's flock, to include the portions where Jesus says, you know, I'm the good shepherd. And, you know, the hired hand is the hired hand, you know, and boy, that's a resonant image for me right now in terms of politicians who are hired hands for larger interests. And, you know, they are not caring for the sheep in the way that the good shepherd does. I would also just kind of add is the Acts text, I think also has something to give to us, because it's coming on the heels of Pentecost, the latter part of Acts 2, verses 42 through 47, where, you know, there was such diversity in the early church, and people came together and held things in common, cared for one another. And I love how at the very last verse talks about how day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. That, you know, diversity isn't necessarily an easy thing to juggle. But the early church, you know, new people were coming in, being added to their numbers, and they were caring for each other. And here we are seeing, you know, talking about numbers, you know, we all have been just kind of fixated on these numbers, and we're seeing numbers rise and rise, but we're not computing that these are people to be cared for. You know, instead, I think that the numbers are, because the hired hands are concerned for the people who are telling them that, you know, we need to get people off of unemployment benefits, you know, and, you know, the wealthy need to get people back to work, you know, to take care of their interests. And, you know, it's infuriating that it is the poor that are the ones who are going to be the hardest hit. And I've been looking at kind of for Nashville, if you look at the counties and you look at, particularly I'm in Davidson County here in Nashville, that it's South Nashville that has such high numbers right now for coronavirus, and it's largely our immigrant communities. And Glencliff also we house our sister church, Nueva Vida Hispanic congregation, you know, and I'm thinking about all the immigrants, the people that have been still out there working, you know, and we need to have shepherds who care for the sheep and are willing to lay down their lives for the sheep, put their bodies, you know, the shepherd put their bodies on the line for the sheep. So I think that these are incredibly resonant passages. Also, I'm fixated with the 23rd Psalm, and particularly the passage that the 23rd Psalm that talks about thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. That, you know, God wills to provide for us even in the presence of enemies, and to remember that that's still sort of very much where we are in life right now.
There's some powerful stuff there. And I mean, like, while we're talking about Nashville, I can report Councilman Freddie O'Connell, who's a good friend of mine, was tweeting today that there's a outbreak in a homeless shelter that's over at the fairgrounds, temporary shelter.
Mm-hmm.
They're seeing a big outbreak there. It's just, you know, this is the people that we
Mm-hmm.
force to live by different standards and make sacrifices we wouldn't expect everyone else to make,
Exactly.
that are going to bear the brunt of this the most.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I could just linger on the Acts for just a second, I appreciate that you took us there. I love this passage, and in part because of the model of community, right? So in verse 44 and 45, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. And it goes on to say they spent time, they broke bread together, they ate their food with glad and generous hearts. That is a profoundly different model for what the community, what the body of Christ looks like than what we're living with today. And it's sort of like, well, how did we lose that? You know, how did we lose this idea of pooling our resources to take care of people? And how did we come to this place where a Christian public position is so often represented as one where we say, well, you earn what you earn, and you know, if you want more, then you should work harder. Or it's a scarcity mindset instead of a caregiving mindset.
Joe, I think it'd be helpful to, you know, put some historical context onto this, even as I, you know,
Please
reemphasize the notion of coded language. Constitutionally, you know, the country was constructed on the labor of people who were not counted. And so, you know, it's not hard to build a wealth model if you have access to free labor. I think this echoes some of what Reverend Moore is talking about with immigrant brothers and sisters and the way that they have been treated. And so for me, from a data standpoint, testing is paramount for me. I recall when Memphis or the Shelby County area initially dropped what it was calling its hotspot maps. And it was talking about the number of cases that were being confirmed and where they were being confirmed. And my initial response to it was, let's be clear, this is not a map that shows where the majority of infections are. It is a map that shows where the majority of the people who have access to testing reside. Because initially, and even still to this very moment, far too often, the only people who get access to testing are people who can afford it, people who have, you know, primary care physicians, people who have good health insurance. And so if you talk about a city like Memphis or a county like Shelby, with the poverty rate so high, you know that there's plenty of people who don't have that, who definitely would love something like Medicare expansion. But again, if you start thinking about the way that the language has been coded and who the laws are constructed to privilege and benefit, and who the laws are constructed to exclude and exploit, then I think that gives us some example as to why there is so much inequity embedded in our social, political, and economic structure. So in the book of Acts, one of the things that it talks about that you highlighted is everyone gave as the other had need. Right now, you have far too many people who have more than they'll ever need, and way too many people who have less than they always need. And right now, there's too many Black people who have to choose between going to work and risking infection or staying at home and now risking termination or eviction.
Absolutely. Wasn't there also something that's just recently said in one of Trump's press conferences in terms of economic aid to cities that if they were sanctuary cities, they were going to have to be turning over their immigrants? Yeah. So the continued exploitation, and it's also interesting. It struck me too when you were talking about the numbers and people who were counted and not counted. It's all just very resonant in a year that I'm still getting all the mailings for the census. This is the census year. You know, about who, you know, who's going to be counted, and those people that are afraid to be counted.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
Dr. Smallwood, please.
Yes.
Your pivot from this point of what you see happening with this sort of commonality of experience, commonality of sharing the goods and the things that we own together. And I have to tell you that the only reason these folk did what they did is because they believed in something. And what did they believe in? They believed in what they saw and what they experienced as wonders and signs. In other words, the leaders, the religious leaders, were performing miracles. They were doing miraculous things before them. And it was enough to cause them to come into a space of understanding their commonality. And so, you know, we see there are a lot of religious communions around, and a lot of what we call forms of godliness, but it's without the power. What is the power that leads us to a place where we understand and know who is the gatekeeper, right? The gates and the gatekeepers are what we're talking about when we think in terms of that clip you showed us earlier with them saying, oh, well, if your boss tells you to come back to work, you got to give up your unemployment. How does that happen, right? The manipulators of the laws, the folk who can say, you know, because it's a at-will state, you are at my will to work. That certainly carries us back to what Dr. Fisher talked about. Historical antecedents tell us that that's how we've always operated. But when we can embrace a power that raised Jesus up from the dead, right? That same spirit living within us, capable of really maintaining some powers and some wonders and some signs that are bigger than what we see these gatekeepers doing. These are folk who operate in a power that's been constructed. They operate in a power that's supernatural. And in order for people to believe in a commonality that brings about communal spirits that really take care of its own, take care of the stranger and the foreigner the way we've been instructed to do, so that we would guard against ICE coming in and taking immigrants, so that we would guard against people's wages being withdrawn from them. So we would guard against people being able to stand up and stand flat-footed and say, if they go back to work, you go back to work, because that's not the law. Who manipulated that? What gatekeeper made that happen? And we need to reorder this thing so that we're not just speaking truth to power, but we're speaking our truth in power.
Certainly, it reiterates the distinction that we were drawing earlier between the good shepherd, the real thing, and the phony thing, right? That which does not believe authentically and isn't following. And it, you know, you raised the point of it being the miracles that helped people get to that point where they could live that way, and it sort of makes me wonder, why isn't the complete collapse of daily life due to COVID-19 sufficient a miracle to make us realize that we are, in fact, #all in this together? Because it doesn't feel like we're all in it together.
Yeah, and I would say that everybody's lives haven't been impacted the same. So going back to the gatekeeping piece, matter of fact, one of the first things that they chose to test opening up in the Memphis area was the golf courses.
Amen.
I mean, so I think what it tells us, you know, going back to points that have already been echoed, is we can use the rhetorical tropes of we're all in this together. But when you are sitting in positions of privilege and, to Dr. Smallwood's point, constructive power, then you get to manipulate the systems in ways that make other people be at higher risk than you. And the numbers bear this out, that when you start talking about people who have already been disproportionately impacted by health disparities in times past, you know, the saying was, if white America has a cold, then Black America has the flu. Well, if white America has COVID-19, Black America must have the Grim Reaper. And so, you know, for me, I want us to be able to center more strongly on who is responsible. This is what I think Dr. Smallwood is highlighting too, and I think Reverend Moore would echo the same sentiments. Who is constructing these things? What kind of coded language are they using? Because we know when the president started to talk about opening up the states, the governors who are opening the states up, by and large, fit a particular description. And we know that they are now able to pass the buck of responsibility off of the states down into the local government, which ultimately is going to pass it off to corporations, which will ultimately pass it off to employees. In the city of Memphis and in the county of Shelby, we have economic task force with no labor represented on the task force, no lay people represented on the task force, but a member of the Edge Board, which gives corporate pilots away by the millions represented there. And so we need to try to figure out who holds the purse strings, how they are delineating the money, who it goes to. And they don't, I think by proxy, have the same risk as people who are forced onto the front lines and don't have the same option. So I just can't say, I know I long for a utopian moment and kumbaya opportunity too, but I am more of a pragmatic realist than I am a naive optimist. And pragmatic realism says, here's where we are. Not everybody is sacrificing the same way. And until we can admit that and hold the people accountable who are constructing, Dr. Smallwood also says something about, we need to re-envision what our society and our structure should look like. That's something that I think needs to happen now, because if it doesn't happen under this pandemic, I'm not sure that it will happen in our lifetime. Because if you can't get people to reconsider the economic and the medical and the political infrastructure at a time like this, we don't even know whose votes are going to be counted come August and November. Mm-hmm. So, until we get more gung-ho about restructuring the entire system and the institutions, my concern is that we'll end up with more of the same.
And wouldn't that just be such a miraculous sign and a terrible wonder if we could get organized around the need to reorganize our culture, our way of life?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I want to, we've been having a great discussion. I want to try to see what happens if I shepherd us, if you will, towards the First Peter, because it's sort of a stick in our wheel.
Yes.
If you will. I'll read it. Verse 19, for it is a credit to you if being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. Quote, he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth, unquote. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep. Here we get back to sheep. But now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Now that just seems kind of, there's a tension there with some of what we've been getting at, and I'm certainly loath to say that suffering is good. I think we would all agree suffering is not good. So what do we make of this text?
Well, one of the things that just first strikes me is at the very beginning, for it is a credit to you if by being aware of God you endure pain while suffering unjustly. In terms of, our culture, and particularly speaking on behalf of white privileged culture, that we don't like to discomfort, and we don't endure it readily. And I think that's one of the things that we continue to see that is disturbing to me, that we see it in the church, is that it's like, oh, well, I don't like that these things aren't open. I don't like that I can't go get my hair colored, or that I can't go get lawn fertilizer or have my nails done. So therefore, everything needs to be opened again. I think that, we are serving and bear the name of a risen Lord, who still bears the wounds of his unjust suffering on his post-resurrection body, that we are to be also wounded healers in his name, but yet we don't want to experience any kind of suffering, and and I just from my own experience went through, we in the Presbyterian churches, we have over the years argued and struggled over the role of LGBTQ Christians and people and what is their place and in our churches and what are their rights and privileges that I definitely saw that people who don't agree and don't want to experience any kind of conflict or any kind of what they consider to be suffering, you know, they'll go to somewhere else. They will not endure it. And we're seeing that now with COVID-19. It's incredible the amount of selfishness to know that we have brothers and sisters who are bearing the brunt, you know, in more numbers than most of us who are privileged are bearing it. And so many don't seem to care. In fact, I had just a quote I wanted to share that I pulled off of a writer, and he's also a professor of religion and the arts, and he teaches at Fuller, I believe. But it's W. David O. Taylor, who does just really tremendous work with the arts and scripture, just has a book out about the Psalms right now. But he says, it's astonishing and not a little disturbing how readily and instinctually my conservative Christian brethren reach for the language of constitutional rights prior to or without any regard for their gospel responsibilities as citizens and neighbors in this country. And I think that we have gospel responsibilities. And in that Peter text that we are called, you know, we have to, in the name of Christ, we do endure suffering. But sometimes on the behalf of the weakest, those who are the least of these in our society. And if it affects other people, even if it is not affecting me, that as a Christian, I should care about that. Because again, the vision from Acts is that, you know, we are supposed to be bearing things in common and not allowing some people to go without or to be hurt. If people don't have health care, if people don't have food, if people are living in the very fear for their lives, you know, we should care about that. And we should be doing everything that we can with our own bodies, as the Good Shepherd does, to stand in, you know, up for them, even if it brings us harm.
So I want to posit a couple of things regarding, you know, that particular passage. I think that people of color, especially Black people in this country, have no shortage of experience of redemptive suffering. So I want to try to appropriate these inquiries and these questions raised in this text to the people I think might need to hear it most. What would Governor Lee say? Ask him to put his level of redemptive suffering on the table, put his record up. He claims Christianity. He has a governor's call with preachers all over the city or all over the state. So ask them to put that up and give us some insights on redemptive suffering. Because I think when you start talking, and I'm building on what I think Reverend Moore was talking about, when you start talking about what it means to do redemptive suffering, historically, there's a group that is always asked to do that. And then there's a group that is rarely, if ever, asked to show the proof of that redemptive suffering. And so I think we have to, in the name of equity, require those who have the most to sacrifice the most. But what we tend to do as like a knee-jerk impulse is, if things get too crucial, you say, hey, bag down, calm down, you know, redemptive suffering is on the table. Jesus not only suffered, he fought. And I think that we need to embrace those or we need to affirm, maybe even highlight those who embrace the fight of Jesus as much as we talk about the redemptive suffering or the faith of Jesus as well. Because his faith didn't just cause him to suffer. He was killed for a reason.
Right.
You know, he didn't just die. He was killed. He was executed.
He was executed, yeah.
He was executed by the state of Rome, considered a rabble-rousing, agitating enemy of the state, which we would call in the 21st century a terrorist. So, you know, I want us to spend as much time elevating, highlighting, and admonishing those on the front lines who are suffering and being exploited to keep fighting, and those who are in positions of privilege and power to start showing the receipts of their redemptive suffering and sacrifice. Because I can't see it. Now, I might be blind to it, but I can't see it. So that all of the questions that we're asking us today about how people of faith are going to continue with redemptive suffering, I want every elected official, especially at the highest office of the land, to have the same question raised to them and ask them to show their scars.
I also want to add, if I may, that we need to be contextual about the suffering. So suffering is not in perpetuity. Even in this passage, it's not talking about a perpetual suffering. It's talking about the passing through of a phase of suffering that then allows you to be approved by God. Now, we in 2019 celebrated 400 years of people from the African continent being brought to North America. And we know that that is a 400 plus year of suffering, largely. What I believe the passage requires us to do is to recognize that there are cycles of suffering that happen in the life of a human being. And when we are called to be disciples of Christ, we must embrace the fact, because it's out of the suffering. See, Peter doesn't stop there. In the 5th chapter, he goes on to say, but after you suffered a while, you'll be settled and established and raised up. And so for me, the idea of passing through suffering is something that we all must acknowledge. We all have our cross to bear. And I think even as Reverend Kristi brought it out, there is a commonality of that. That's what this season is about, right? It reminds us of that. But we don't stay there. And more importantly, if we in fact have embraced the thing that causes us to confront those who bring on the suffering, then we then become the ones who are agents of healing, because that's what 224 is all about. It's the life that you live in righteousness that brings about that healing, not only for yourself, but you're living under a healing balm that comes because of what Christ did on the cross.
I just want to, that's fantastic, because my main concern with this passage is the old Marx critique that religion is the opiate of the masses, right? That it inures us to the struggles of life and tells us, it's fine, don't push back, don't rise up, just keep struggling, keep suffering. And I love that, because the point is to live for righteousness. The point is to be lifted up. The point is to be transformed, not to stay in a place of just suffering passively and accepting that.
Yeah.
Well,
and I
ahead.
I just would add to, just kind of building on what has been said, is just also keeping in mind that, it really resonates with me, the fact that to remember that Jesus didn't just choose to suffer for suffering's sake. I mean, he was executed. He was executed by the state. He was executed by the empire of the day. And America is the empire of our day and our time. And it's something you very much see where people's loyalties lie in terms of how we as Christians, handle what our empire is doing in our name, and what, not just to our own people, but to the world. And that's a weighty subject that I know probably takes us way too far, but it's just something I'm mindful of.
Yeah, that is a weighty subject. I think it's probably a little too weighty for this moment, because we're just past 1 o'clock. And we're going to open it up just for a second. If anybody who's one of the attendees, if you want to chime in, if there's something that happened today that resonated with you that you want to speak to, or some angle you want to raise and hear us talk about, go ahead and raise your hand on the Zoom app, and we'll boost you in. We've got oh, Belinda, you put your hand. Oh, Dawn. Okay, hold on a second, Dawn. And you should be. You might have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me, Joe?
Yep.
Hi, this is Reverend Don Bennett. I am the pastor at the table in Nashville, Tennessee, and I really want to thank the folks, the other pastors who are represented here. What is absolutely striking to me, I work every single day with very marginalized, vulnerable populations, and two conversations that I have had in the last 2 days regarding opening up the state, I have not heard anybody talk about. And so Reverend Dr. Smallwood has touched on it a number of times in terms of thieves and bandits and this gatekeeper. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a young mother who is in the hospitality industry, who is currently receiving unemployment because she works in a restaurant with a bar and live entertainment, so she's not able to work. She's receiving unemployment, which is helping her pay her bills for now. Her child is not able to go to daycare. So what is going to get caught in the crosshairs here is folks who are living literally paycheck to paycheck, whose needs are being met for the most part via unemployment right now, and they are able to take care of their children. When they are forced to go back to work because we are in a right to work state, the daycares are not being opened. So these young these young families are now forced to put the health and welfare of their children at further risk in a variety of ways, because they are now bringing germs back into their home if they do go back to work, or they are having to experience additional financial burdens for finding daycare for their children. And oftentimes it's resulting in leaving children at home alone because it's only for a few hours. And that is a really dangerous thing that is, it's not even being talked about. So I wanted to raise that awareness. The other thing, I've been hosting online support groups, primarily for parents of LGBTQ youth. And the reason I'm raising this now is because everybody is in effect homeschooling. And I sat in a group last night where there were 2 school counselors on the line as part of this professional cohort I was with, and they were just very open and honest that the online schooling is not working, particularly in Davidson County. It is widespread knowledge now that none of the work that the children are being encouraged to do or expected to do has any merit or value toward their grades for the rest of the year. And so naturally, nobody really wants to do that work. And the problem that this is creating is that a lot of these parents who are now working from home now stay at home with their children and help out where they can, even though they themselves are not trained teachers. So forcing people back into the workplace is exponentially harmful on so many levels. And I found it very abhorrent that the short clip you showed at the beginning was about 15 seconds long and left absolutely no wiggle room whatsoever for feedback or for further questions. And I think that just speaks volumes to the powers at play and the powers in the state of Tennessee. And I'll tell you, I have to be honest, I have a lot of conversations with pastors on a national level, and it is almost embarrassing to have to represent the state of Tennessee at this point in time. Thank you, though.
Sorry, I was on mute. Dawn, thanks for calling in. I can say that the Department of Labor does say that if you are a parent and you are not able to work unless your kid is in school, that you are technically still eligible for unemployment, but and I don't think this will come as any surprise, but like you're going to have to go through the process of proving that, right? You're going to have to go through the process of getting that exception, and that's, that is just another hoop that I think we all know that some people will have an easier time navigating than others, and it's going to produce disproportionate outcomes. So thanks for joining us for a second there. Well, it looks like we lost Kristi there. I think this is probably going to be the end of our show. It's been a blessed hour to spend with all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that anyone who wanted to chime in maybe didn't have thoughts in the moment, but if you think of it later, please join the discussion on Facebook. We'll be posting this video later, and we'll also be posting it into the Facebook group. If you want to go out and find the Southern Christian Coalition members group, you can join the conversation there. Thanks again to all of our panelists for joining us, and thanks to all of our attendees. It looks like we've got one. Oh, Kristi's back. That was well, we're going to go ahead and close it, but thanks for coming back, Reverend Moore, and thank you all for being on the show. Thank you so much.